religious cynicism, quoting Benjamin Disraeli. And what will you do with the Grail when you have found it? Quoting Ernst Bloch, Das Prinzip Hoffnung, page 1299. Even grinning is mixed in with it, like that of the skull itself, because the fact that long-planning human beings depart like cattle is also somehow funny. Suddenly, someone leaves the visible and continuous world common to all and ceases to share existence with us. His breathing has stopped. His movements have ceased. At first, death manifests itself negatively. Something is extinguished and passes over into stillness. A little later, this cessation shows also its positive side. The body becomes cold, starts to putrefy, rot. The skeleton then steps forth as the part that resists decomposition longer than the other parts. It takes over the representation of what remains to us in materia. Hence the skeleton as death imago. The framework of bones symbolises the end that all who live already carry within themselves. Every one of us is our own friend, Mr. D, the bony forerunning of one's own departure. From the perspective of this side of death, the only one usually observable, the idea imposes itself on living persons that an invisible force is at work in animated bodies that allows them to breathe, jump about, and remain form-coherent, whereas this invisible something must have departed from the dead so that they can grow stiff and decay. The invisible something stimulates breathing, movement, feeling, alertness, and the maintenance of the body's form. It is the epitome of intensity and energy. Its activity creates, although not visibly or in a way that can be isolated, the most real reality. This invisible force has many names: soul, spirit, breath, ancestors, fire, form, God, life. Experience teaches that animals like us are born and die, that plants germinate and pass away, and that they too in their own way participate in the rhythm of death and life, form constitution and form dissolution. Without doubt, the human soul is surrounded by a cosmos of animal and plant life, and by mysterious energy subjects that are active behind day and night, storm and calm sky, heat and cold. In nothing does this being surrounded suggest a domination of humankind over nature and the environment. Rather, the naked biped appears as a being that is tolerated and endured by the whole, insofar as it controls the interactions with the bringers of bounty and danger from the animal and plant world. Life and death, coming and going, they are initially natural constants, pulsating beats in a rhythm in which is pre-given, in which what is pre-given outweighs what is added later. In the course of civilization, however, the relation between submission and action, suffering and doing, has shifted. Also with regard to the experience of death. What appeared to be an aspect of natural pulsations becomes in more developed societies a more and more profound and more embittered struggle between life and death. Death is then no longer so much an event that nothing can influence, but is itself something that our violence and caprice bring about. Its primary image is no longer the unavoidable coming to an end, nor the peaceful self-exhaustion, or the quiet and unresisted burning down of life's flame, but a contested, horrifying happening imbued with premonitions of violence and murder. The more people think of death as being murdered, rather than as being peacefully extinguished, the more violently must the flood of the fear of death swell up in empires. the flood of the fear of death swell up in higher and more violent civilizations. For this reason, the historical states and empires, wherever we look, are religious states and empires. They constitute social worlds in which the fear of violent death is a realistic one. We all have 1,000 images of violence before our eyes. Surprise attacks, massacres, rapes, public executions, wars, scenes of torture, in which human beings develop themselves into diabolical fiends in order to extract the maximum of agony from the death of others. In addition, class societies suppress the vital energies of subjects and slaves through physical and symbolic violence, in such a way that shadowy hollows of unlived life unfailingly open up in bodies, where wishing, fantasizing, the yearning for the divine otherness of a full life begin to brood. This unlived life combines its utopian energies from the fears of annihilation that are distilled in the individual and violent societies from infancy onward. Only out of this combination comes the absolute defiance of death in civilized human beings, a defiance that seemingly cannot be dissolved by anything. This is the answer to the profoundly terrifying experience of civilization. Our being in society comprises almost a priori the threat that we will not be allowed to realize the vitality with which we were born. Every socialized life lives with the premonition that its energies, time, willing, and wishing will not be at an end when the death knell rings. Life builds residues, an immense burning not yet that needs more time and future than is granted to the individual. Life dreams beyond itself and dies full of defiance. For this reason, the history of higher civilizations vibrates with countless and boundless not yet screams, with a million voiced no to a death that is not the expiration of the dying embers of life, but a violent suffocation of a flame that in any case did not burn as brightly as it could have done in a vital freedom. Since that time, devitalized life in class and military societies ponders its compensations, whether in further lives, as supposed by Hindu consciousness, or in heavenly existence as promised by Christianity and Islam, for the thwarted dreams of their believers. Religion is not primarily the opiate of the people, but the reminder that there is more life in us than this life lives. The function of faith is an achievement of devitalized bodies that cannot be completely robbed of the memory that in them much deeper sources of vitality, strength, pleasure, and of the enigma and intoxication of being there must lie hidden than can be seen in everyday life. This gives religions their ambiguous role in societies. They can be used to legitimate and double, verdoppeln, oppression. See the Enlightenment's Critique of Religion in Chapter 3, the section entitled Critique of Religious Illusion. They can, however, also liberate individuals to a greater power of resistance and creativity by helping them to overcome fear. Thus, depending on circumstances, religion can be both an instrument of domination and the core of resistance against domination, a medium of repression and a medium of emancipation, an instrument of devitalization and a precept of revitalization. The first case of religious cynicism in the Judeo-Christian tradition has no one other than the original father, Moses, in the role of cynical rebel. He committed the first blasphemy of great dimensions when, on his return from Mount Sinai, he smashed the tablets. Exodus 31:18. They were tables of stone written on by the finger of God. Exodus 32:16. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God graven upon the tables. Moses, who, with the divine laws under his arm, came down from the mountain and found his people dancing around the golden calf, set an example for the religious Cynic's behaviour with respect to the sacred. He smashed everything that was not spirit, but letter, not God, but idol, not the living, but its representation. It is emphasised that he did this in anger, and that it was a holy anger that gave him the right and the necessity and the necessary impertinence to lay violent hands on God's personal handwriting. That needs to be understood. Namely, immediately after he had shattered the tablets, so the biblical account says, Moses seized the golden calf, melted it in the fire, verse 32:20, ground it to powder and scattered it upon the water, and made the children of Israel drink of it. Later, Moses had to chisel new tablets so that God could inscribe them a second time. He also received from God the commandment, "Thou shalt make no graven images." Moses' cynical blasphemy came from the knowledge that people are inclined to worship fetishes and to indulge in the idolization of objects. But nothing material can be so holy that it may not be smashed as soon as it becomes apparent that the representations of the sacred have begun to overshadow the spirit of the religion. In this regard, it can happen that no distinction is made between the stone tablets of the dear Lord and the golden calf. If it is a representation, or idol, then smite it. That is the spiritual cynical core of the commandment, to make no image of God. Image and text can fulfill their functions only as long as it is not forgotten that both are material forms, and that the truth, as a material-immaterial structure, must always be written and read anew, that is, materialized and at the same time immaterialized anew, which means that every materialization will be shattered whenever it begins to force itself into the foreground. All primary blasphemies are born by the cynical impulse to not let oneself be made a fool of by any idol. Those who know something of the gods know the great rage of Moses and the cynical lightness in dealing with representations of the divine. Religious persons, in contrast to pious persons, are no buffoons of the superego. It knows the laws, and religious persons know that it knows the laws, and they let them speak, and they obey them too when it seems appropriate. This distinguishes the primary blasphemy of mystics, the religious, and the cynically alive, from the secondary blasphemies that arise from resentment, unconscious compulsions for vices, and an unfree desire to drag down whatever is elevated. The first cynicism of the religious type likewise is found in the Old Testament. Significantly, it is contained in the story of the first murder in human history, in the story of Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve had 2 sons among their children. Cain, the firstborn, was a farmer, and Abel, the second, was a shepherd. One day both brought sacrifices to the Lord, Cain from the fruit of his fields, and Abel from the youngest of his herd. The Lord, however, welcomed only Abel's offering, and cast scorn upon Cain's. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance became distorted. Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? Genesis 4, 5-9. With this question, the stage for religious cynicism is set. The art of dissimulation, spoken of here for the first time, is directly connected with the cynical turning of a violent consciousness against the other. What can Cain answer? Whatever he said, it would have to be cynical, for in truth he does not intend to tell the truth. The communication with the questioner is distorted from the start. Cain could, if he felt he had nothing to lose, answer his God, Don't be so hypocritical. You know as well as I do where Abel is, for I have killed him with my own hands, and you not only looked on calmly, but even gave me occasion to do it. Cain's real answer, in its brevity, still has enough cynical bite. I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Genesis 4:9. An all-knowing and infinitely just God, as Cain's testy retort suggests, should be able to refrain from such prickings of conscience. What kind of God is it who treats people unequally, and at the very least provokes them to crime, but then with pretended innocence asks questions about what had happened? God, if one may say so, does not penetrate every consciousness. Cain closes off his conscience to this non-penetrating God. See also the psychology of children who grow up under great fear of punishment. He reacts insolently, evasively, impudently. With this first crime, even more than with the fall from grace, as is shown by the myth in the Old Testament, something has happened that makes a deep cleft in the still fresh creation. Things begin to slip away from God. Cruelties occur in the world with which he does not reckon, and with whose just atonement he does not yet know quite how to deal. The point of the Cain story, remarkably enough, seems to be that God, as if he had become pensive, not only does not punish the murderer Cain, but with the mark of Cain, expressly puts him under his personal protection. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." For whatever avenges itself would definitely not be a God at the heights of what is possible. The God of the ancient Hebrews has many traits of a bad-tempered, embittered old man, who no longer completely understands the world, and who, with a jealous and mistrustful countenance, observes everything that goes on down below. Nevertheless, the reprisal for Cain's original crime is postponed until the day of judgment. God grants himself and humankind a respite, and the myths about the day of judgment emphasize that a considerable amount of time will elapse before it arrives. The time of a great opportunity. It is the time God needs to become just, and the time we need to understand what proper living is. Both mean basically the same thing. How the Christianization of power in the end phase of the Roman Empire, and even more during the European Middle Ages, led to cynical effects was indicated earlier in this chapter, the cynicism of state and hegemonic power. Catholic masters' cynicism reached its peak at the time of the Crusades, in which the origins of the Inquisition are to be found. If we express this concisely with the phrase, "the persecution of Christians by Christians," this outlines the reflexive, cynical practice of lying by the Master Church, whose gloomiest representatives, in the style of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, do not shrink from incinerating the returned Jesus, just as they did those heretics who strove to revive his teachings. They knew precisely what they were doing, and it is probably a romantic simplification to label these gentlemen of the Inquisition Catholic fanatics, as historiography so creepily puts it. Would that not mean to underestimate them, and to declare them to be blind agents of a purported faith and a rigid conviction? Can we seriously attribute such naiveties to powerful and educated representatives of the Christ religion? Do they not themselves appeal to God incarnate as their idol, who had become conspicuous as a rebel and, for his part, stood in the tradition of the founder of a religion who, in a holy rage, had shattered God's own inscribed commandments on the ground? Don't they know? Don't they have to know? And, as inquisitors, don't they have daily impressed on their minds that this religion is based on a call to imitate Christ, so that the imitators, precisely when they behave heretically, are possibly closer to the source than the learned and cynical administrators of the letter? It has already been shown how Friedrich Schlegel conceived of the cynical dimension of the Christ religion as religious resistance against the power state, in fact against every form of raw, unreflective and egoistically insensitive worldliness. As soon as a power state in the robes of Christianity, whether it be as papacy or as the Holy Roman Empire or of the German nation, was established, and the brutal world of the masters began to become too impudent, cynical ascetics appeared in the Middle Ages who, with the death skull and the great reaper, tried to cut the haughty men of the world down to size. They tried to provoke power-hungry conquerors of lands to critical self-reflection by pointing out that after they died, they would possess just as much ground as was necessary for burial. A motif in the critique of power that has been kept alive up to Brecht's lyrical cynicisms of the 1920s and beyond. the cynical Christianity of the Middle Ages, resolutely committed to reflection and resistance with its memento mori, fought in ever-recurring waves against the tendencies of luxuria and superbia, of bodily lust and unreflecting worldly greed for life. The great reform movements, whose first wave emanated from the Cluniac monasteries, and whose influence stretched well into the raw and chaotic warring feudal systems of the 10th and 11th centuries, appear to me to be indeed cynically inspired in the religious sense. The second great wave, which in the 12th and 13th centuries spread ascetic and mystical experiences into broader circles, also contained cynical elements. It was no different with the beginnings of reform in the 14th centuries and 15th centuries, and the cynical element was even stronger in the great era of the Reformations and Reformers, among whom Luther, the Pope as the devil's sow, who combined with his person cynical prototypes from Moses and David up to Eulenspiegel, his literary contemporary, advanced with a primitive polemical intensity the idea of a self-renewal of religion from the spirit and against the idols of tradition. The late Middle Ages provides examples of the overturning of ascetic motifs, as shown by the following novella. A beautiful young woman had been wooed by an admirer for a long time, but for fear of harming her soul in her chastity, she rejected him again and again. Her resistance against the man's wooing was supported by a priest of the town, who continually admonished her to preserve her virtue. One day when the priest was forced to leave the town to travel to Venice, he made the woman solemnly pledge not to weaken in his absence. She promised, but on the condition that the priest bring her one of the famous mirrors from Venice. During the priest's absence, she in fact withstood all temptations. Upon his return, however, she asked for the promised Venetian mirror. Thereupon the priest pulled a skull out from under his robe and thrust it cynically into the young woman's face. "Vain woman, here you see your true face. Consider that you must die and that you are nothing before God." The woman was horrified to the marrow. That same night she surrendered herself to her suitor, and from then on enjoyed with him the joys of love. Unfortunately, I had to relate the story from memory, since I could not relocate the source. Therefore I can vouchsafe only the gist, but not the wording or detail of the novella. As soon as Christians recognise themselves in the death skull, as in a mirror, they can come to a point where the fear of death recedes before the fear of not having lived. They then understand that it is precisely the climbing into bed with the whore world that represents the chance of this irretrievable life. From the beginning, Christian religion is haunted by a characteristic problem, that of not being able to believe. As organised religion, it is, in its innermost core, already a religion of bad faith, of insincerity, namely to the extent that it is based not on the imitation of Christ, but on the imitation of the imitation, on the legend of Christ, the myth of Christ, the dogma and idealisation of Christ. The process of dogmatization is marked by bad faith, for there are two dimensions of unavoidable uncertainty that, through dogmatization, are deceivingly turned into certainty. First, what was left behind by Jesus was extraordinarily fragmentary, and not comprehensible in its authenticity with final certainty, so that it is all too understandable that in the centuries following Jesus' death, the most diverse interpretations of Christianness could be developed. The mere fact that they developed demonstrate a certain tradition of inspiration, that is, a handing down of the original experience the first Christians had shared with Jesus, the experience of an unconditional affirmation that, as love and fearlessness, must have made an indelible impression on all those who encountered the early Christians. The dogmatization arises, according to one point of view, in the competitive struggle of various Christian organisations and mythologies, none of which can be sure whether, after all, the spirit is not also present in the rival Christian organisation and mythology. In the obvious and undeniable plurality of Christendoms, only a primary bad faith can want to establish itself as the sole true faith. This marks the second dimension of bad faith, in the repudiation of alternative Christendoms, and in the corresponding theological, intellectual elaboration of the Christ religion. The antagonism between myth and understanding, between faith and knowledge, had to break out, and the more starkly it broke out, the stronger became the tendency to bridge it with disingenuous, self-manipulative acts of consciousness. In the theological dogmatization of the Christ religion, innumerable lies were told in this dimension of the objectively problematic, as if one believed one's own faith. But the history of Christian theology and dogmatics is at least just as much a history of doubting but wanting to believe, as a history of believing. Christian theology is the equally immense and spectral attempt to seek certainty, precisely where the nature of things does not permit certainty. This theology has a demonstrable, auto-hypnotic dimension. It begins working on what we today call ideology, that is, the instrumental use of understanding to paralogically legitimate pre-given aims, interests and identifications. Even in its first moment, theology is a hybrid construction of faith and doubt that wants to lie its way back into the simplicity of mere faith. It formulates confessions in a dogmatically fixed form, whereas a confession by nature can relate only to what is an immediate certainty for confessors, that is, their self-experiences and inwardness. In these, they do not find primarily the formulated faith as such. They find doubt, not certainty. What we today call confession probably circumscribes the sum of things we doubt, rather than the things of which we can be sure. This legacy of bad faith has been passed on from the Christian structure of mentality to practically everything that has arisen as ideology and Weltanschauung of Western soil in the time since Christ. There is, on our cultural soil, a tradition that teaches how to present what is uncertain, per se, in the raiment of conviction, what is believed as something that is known, the confession as a strategic lie. This inner problematic of bad faith experienced a dramatic escalation in the wrangle of the Catholic Counter-Reformation with the Protestant movements. These movements, if we observe only their intra-religious historical emergence, had become necessary precisely because of the phenomena connected with bad faith, which in Catholicism had resulted in an insufferable amount of corruption and deceitfulness. The reforms were concerned with the miserable credibility of faith, the hollowness, coarseness and cynicism in the spectacle of the Catholic Church. When the Counter-Reformation then armed itself theologically against the Protestant challenge, it inevitably felt a compulsion to reform, because it could not overcome the opponent without studying its armament and its critique of Catholicism. From then on, a mute, cynical reflexivity increased within Catholic theology, which practiced thinking the opponent's thoughts without letting its own confessions show that it had long since known more than it said and believed. Talk like the rearguard, think like the vanguard. That became the psychological strategic secret for the functioning of the Jesuit order, which, like a spiritual militia, constituted the intellectual elite in a struggle against Protestantism. In some areas, this technique is still employed today. The conservative style of ideology, to work with the high degree of consciousness towards an instrumental diminution of one's own intelligence, and a self-censorship through artful conventionality, has to the present day something of the former Jesuit manner in the modern world. Let me try that again. The conservative style of ideology, to work with a high degree of consciousness towards an instrumental diminution of one's own intelligence, and a self-censorship through artful conventionality, has to the present day something of the former Jesuit manner. In the modern world, being a Catholic really has to be learned, for it presupposes the capacity to develop a bad faith to the second degree. Poor Hans Kung. After such brilliant studies, He should have known that the Catholic way of being intelligent pays off only when one knows how to decently conceal that one knows too much. The history of modern secularization also touches on cynical phenomena in religion. In this process of secularization, the partly cynically admonishing, partly cynically intimidating propaganda of skulls and skeletons comes to an end. In a fully militarized, consumption-oriented society of the capitalist, or socialist type, the memento mori no longer has a chance. In the death's head, no one any longer sees his true face. Since the 19th century, such death motifs have been forced into a black romanticism and have been treated only aesthetically. The tension between religion and worldly society over what constitutes real living has deceptively dissolved without residue in favour of the worldly, political, social and cultural forces. Those who demand more life, a more intensive life, a higher life, or a real life, see themselves, at least since the 18th century, presented with a series of non-religious revitalizations that have assumed something from the positive legacy of religion. Art, science, erotics, travelling, consciousness of the body, politics, psychotherapy and the like. All of them can contribute something to the reconstruction of that full life that was the dream and memory core of religion. In this sense, it is justifiable to speak of religion as becoming superfluous. The living being from whom not so much is taken anymore does not want to get everything back later. Human life that no longer remains so far below its own potentialities has in fact less reason to seek a compensatory religiosity. For those for whom life on earth is no longer so miserable, heaven itself no longer promises something completely different. The principal powers of devitalization, family, state, the military, have since the 19th century created their own ideologies of revitalization. Consumerism, sexism, sports, tourism, the cult of violence, mass culture, that the conservative clerical groups cannot match with anything similarly attractive. Modern mass vitalisms contribute a great deal to the circumstance that today's societies, at least on the level of the more robust vital functions, no longer thirst for religion. On the whole, they have become religiously dreamless. When today too little of something is felt, it is expressed in a language of worldly concerns. Too little money, too little time, too little sex, too little fun, too little security, and so on. Only recently has a new phrase surfaced. There is too little meaning. And with this neoconservative sob, a demand for religion is again heard. A demand that has led to a flourishing trade in meaning, without much feel for the fact that it is the addiction to meaning that gives all sorts of nonsense the opportunity to sell itself as the way to salvation. Only so much is certain. The coarser, so-called material, possibilities of revitalization in our culture, precisely when we avail ourselves of them to some extent, expose deeper levels of our being dead that are not really touched by the vitalism of consumption. Sport, disco fever, and free sexuality. This inner level of death is what was earlier called nihilism. A mixture of disillusionment and violent despair stemming from the feeling of emptiness and arbitrary craving. Without doubt, experiences of this type played a subliminal role in National Socialism, that in some respects resembles a nihilistic religion. It was, by the way, the only political force in the 20th century that, in a petulant master's cynical pose, again dared to appropriate for itself the old symbols of the Christian admonition of death. Its ideological vanguard, the SS, chose, not without a good feel for self-representation, the skull and crossbones as its symbol. In matters concerning disinhibition, absolutely nothing can outdo German fascism. Fascism is the vitalism of the dead. As political movement, they want to have their dance. This vitalism of death, which characterises Western cultural institutions to the present day, is embodied, literarily as well as in reality, in vampire figures that, for lack of their own life force, emerge as the living dead among the not yet extinguished to suck their energies into themselves. Once the latter are sucked dry, then they too become vampires. And once they have become devitalized at their core, they crave the vitality of others. In Christian times, the appeal to reflect on authentic living runs media vita in morte sumus. In the midst of life, we are nevertheless already surrounded by death. Today, do we not have to say conversely, media morte in vita sumus? In the midst of all-pervading death, there is nevertheless something in us that is more alive than is lived by our lifeless life. What do the anxious person, the security person, the wage labour person, the defence person, the care-laden person, the history person, the planning person know of life? When we add up the contents of our life, we find that there is a lot that is left out and little fulfilment, a lot of dull dreaming and little presence. Here, life means being not yet dead. To learn to live again leads via a great labour of recollection, but not a labour that only stirs up old stories. The innermost recollection leads not to a story, but to a force. To touch this force means to experience a flood of ecstasy. This experience ends up not in a past, but in a rapturous now.